Next year, we are finally going to be seeing the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Scarlett launch, 7 years after the PS4 and Xbox One first hit the market. There's been a lot of discussion on what these new consoles might bring to the table, from Sony and Microsoft, among developers, as well as here on GamingBolt itself. However, much of the discourse has centered around the hardware capabilities of these machines, or their online services, or their backward compatibility and ecosystem lock-in with their predecessors. One thing that people have, surprisingly enough, not brought up much with respect to these consoles are the controllers, which are in fact the primary and only way you interact with the games that you play. On one hand, this represents a certain level and degree of contentment with where the controllers currently are. The DualShock 4 and the Xbox One controller, as well as the Switch Pro, have all achieved what we might view as the pinnacle of controller design. All three are exceptionally ergonomic, well-designed to support multiple forms of input, and allow for complex control schemes. Sure, people have some complaints with each of them. For instance, DualShock 4's light is annoying, and the battery life is awful. Xbox One's controller lacks a dedicated share button, and that's killer. Switch Pro's D-pad is terrible, but on the whole, what people want are very specific complaints addressed with these controllers, rather than a full-fledged reinvention. No one is looking for an N64 controller or a Wiimote-style radical reimagining of what a game controller is anymore. Which, combined with how the next generation of consoles seems to be iterative, building on the PS4 and Xbox One rather than being a clean break from their predecessors, as has been the norm with every console generation in the past so far, seems to suggest that the controllers will similarly be more or less similar to the current ones. The DualShock 5 will probably have better battery, please, and support USB-C. The Xbox Scarlett controller presumably gets the share button it currently lacks, and now uses a built-in battery. But anything beyond that seems to be a bit off of the table. After all, what would it even be? A look at other controllers gives us some idea of what other improvements these future controllers could implement. A very obvious addition is paddles. Valve first introduced them with the Steam controller, and Microsoft included them with the Xbox One Elite controller, as well as its follow-up. The Steam controller and the Elite controller both have limited market penetration, but the paddles were received very well, and it is possible, though not necessarily likely, that we may see them on the next DualShock and Xbox controllers. I'm not entirely sure on whether or not that might happen. Currently, games don't need any additional input beyond what present controllers already have, and paddles add fragile parts to controllers that could lead to higher defect rates. They also look goofier and more intimidating to the average person, making it less likely that they would want to pick up the controller to play a game with. At the very least, I feel like paddles might be offered as an option, whether on a pricier variant of the controller or as something that you can snap on and off if and when needed, but not a permanent part of it otherwise. I just don't see paddles being a permanent fixture on the only controllers these next-generation consoles have. Another obvious fix, this one specific to the Xbox controller, is the inclusion of a gyro. Motion controls aren't the primary form of interacting with games, but they're still widely used for aiming and move assists, usually implemented as options. The DualShock 4 and Switch controllers all have gyros, but the Xbox One controller does not. It makes sense to a certain degree. The Xbox One controller was designed when the console was going to have the Kinect be an integral part of it, so any motion sensing needs could be implemented using Kinect rather than having to be built into the controller itself. This, of course, is also the reason why there's no share button on the controller, because back in the day, Microsoft envisioned us shouting "Xbox, record that" to take photos and videos. The Kinect ended up not being the future of Xbox, which means that the Xbox One is now the only major platform on the market to not support any form of motion input. PS4, Switch, 3DS, phones, tablets, VR, even the PS Vita all support motion, but the Xbox One does not. Presumably, Microsoft will be throwing in a gyroscope in the Xbox Scarlett controller because it's an obvious and unobtrusive addition that can be entirely ignored by those who want nothing to do with it. But those additions feel small. Certainly they don't seem to be introducing anything anyone might consider a deal breaker. Then again, when was the last time that actually happened? Nintendo's fiddling with controllers aside, they've been pretty static for the last 2 decades now. When was the last time Microsoft or Sony actually substantially altered their core controller design? And not that there's anything wrong with that, of course. The core controller design has remained the same for so long because it works. There's no reason to upend a table that doesn't need upending. And while for a mechanics-focused company like Nintendo, it does make sense to want to experiment with input methods, though even Nintendo seems to have given up and has settled into the standard controller design now. Microsoft and Sony, as well as all the third parties who put games onto their systems, know the controller design, know what to expect from it, and design their games around expecting that standard of input. Changing that would be disruptive to a whole lot of people and not just change-averse players who would inevitably cry foul were it to happen. So, when the PS5 and Xbox Scarlett hit next year, we can expect to see them build on the PS4 and Xbox One in all sorts of ways. Hardware that builds upon current generation hardware, services that build upon current generation services, backward compatibility with current generation games, and yes, controllers that are largely iterative, if that, improvements on the current controllers. Nothing more is needed. For many, the controller is just a means to an end, said end being the fantastic games these consoles will inevitably be host to anyway. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.